Hello, my name is Valeriya and I'm an English teacher. The family consists of Mr. Banks, Mrs. Banks, and their 3 children. Disagree. And their 4 children. Mr. Banks went to the city every day except Sundays. Yes, agree. Mrs. Banks went into the drawing room and read a book. Disagree. She wrote letters to the newspapers. Upstairs in the nursery, Jane and Michael stood at the window and looked into the street. Agree. When the woman opened the gate of the garden, she quickly walked to the door of the house. Agree. The woman had blonde hair, small feet and hands, and large blue eyes. Disagree. The woman had black hair, large feet and hands, and small blue eyes. Jane and Michael could slide up the banisters and often did it. Disagree. They could slide down the banisters. She took out of the empty bag an apron and tied it round her waist. Agree. Today it is listening and lesson 2. Let's start our lesson. It will be the same pronunciation, listening, and tasks. Okay, let's go. Please repeat after me. Uncle, sure, wearing, buttons, through, thought, pleasant, chant, light, balloon, serious, strange, pity, love, usually, circus. Polite, politely, angrily, voice, proud, knocked, loud, bright, fireplace, biscuits, chocolates, sailing, midnight, suddenly, tried, rolling, behavior, comfortable, age, even, surprise, sights, without, explain. Mary Poppins, Chapter 2, Laughing Gas. Jane, Michael, and Mary Poppins got off the bus. "Are you sure your uncle is at home?" said Jane. Mary Poppins sniffed. "My uncle has asked me to bring you to tea today," she said. "Do you think he's not at home?" "Why is your uncle called Mr. Wig?" asked Michael. "Is it because he has a wig on his head?" "He has no wig," said Mary Poppins. "And he is called Mr. Wig because his name is Mr. Wig. And if you ask any more questions, we will go back home." Mary Poppins put her head straight before a shop window. She liked to look at her in shop windows. Today she was wearing a blue coat with silver buttons and a blue hat. She thought that she looked very smart. "Come along," she said. They turned the corner and went up to number 3, Robertson Road. Mary Poppins rang the doorbell. The door opened, and they saw a very thin lady. "Is he at home?" said Michael. "How do you do, Mrs. Wick?" said Jane politely. "Mrs. Wick?" said the thin lady angrily. Her voice was even thinner than she herself. "How can you call me Mrs. Wick? No, thank you. I'm Miss Persimmon, and I am proud of it. Mrs. Wick indeed. Go upstairs and to the first door on the landing." And she went away along the corridor. Jane, Michael, and Mary Poppins went upstairs. Mary Poppins knocked at the door. Come in, and welcome," said a loud and merry voice from the room. Mary Poppins opened the door and they went in. They saw a large room. There was a bright fire in the fireplace, and in the center of the room there was a very large table with 4 cups, bread and butter, biscuits, chocolates, and a very large cake. "I'm very glad to see you," said a voice. Jane and Michael looked around the room, but saw nobody. Then they saw that Mary Poppins was looking at the ceiling. They looked at the ceiling too, and to their surprise, they saw a round, fat man who was hanging in the air. Mr. Wick smiled at the children. "My dear," he said to Mary Poppins, "it is my birthday today." "Oh," said Mary Poppins. Mr. Wick looked at the children again. "I see you are surprised," he said. "I think I must explain to you why I'm here. You see, I'm a very merry man and like to laugh very much. Everything seems funny to me, and I can laugh at everything that I see." And Mr. Wick began to shake with laughter. "Uncle Albert," said Mary Poppins, and Mr. Wick stopped laughing. "Oh, I'm sorry, my dear," he said to Mary Poppins. "I won't laugh if I can." He turned to the children. "You see," he said, "when my birthday comes on Friday, it always happens to me." "But why?" began Jane. "But how?" began Michael. "If my birthday comes on Friday and I laugh on the day, I become filled with laughing gas. The laughing gas is very light, and when it fills me, I simply cannot stand on the ground. As soon as I begin laughing or even smiling, I fly up like a balloon. And I can't get down only if I think about something serious." Mr. Wick began laughing again, but then he looked at Mary Poppins and stopped. "It is strange, of course," he said, "but very pleasant. Does it ever happen to you?" he said Jane and Michael. Jane and Michael shook their heads. "One day," said Mr. Wick, "I went to the circus and I laughed so much that I flew up to the ceiling and couldn't get down until midnight, and then, of course, at 12 o'clock I suddenly fell down because, you see, it was already Saturday and not my birthday. It's strange, isn't it? And funny, isn't it? And now it is Friday again and my birthday, and you two and Mary have come to visit me, and it is very nice. Oh, don't make me laugh, please, don't make me laugh." And Mr. Wick began laughing and shaking under the ceiling again and couldn't stop. He looked so funny that Jane and Michael began laughing too. They wanted to be polite and tried not to laugh, but they couldn't do nothing. They laughed more, and soon they fell down and were rolling and rolling on the floor and could not stop laughing. "Really?" said Mary Poppins. "Really such behavior? I can't help it, I can't help it," cried Michael, and he was still rolling on the floor. "It is so funny. Oh, Jane, isn't it funny?" Then a very strange thing happened. Jane and Michael became very light and flew up in the air. The next moment they were hanging under the ceiling near Mr. Wick. "Hello," said Mr. Wick. "It's very nice of you. You saw that I couldn't come down to you, so you came up to me. It's really very, very nice of you." And all the three of them began laughing again. "I say," said Mr. Wick to the children when they stopped laughing, "there are no chairs here, but I think you can sit on the air. Look at me, I'm sitting." And indeed, Mr. Wick was sitting on the air. Jane and Michael tried to sit down too and found that they also could sit on the air, and was very comfortable. Mr. Wick looked down at Mary Poppins. "I see you don't like it, my dear," he said. "I'm very sorry, but you see that I can't help it." Mary Poppins looked very serious. "Well, I must say," she said, "I have never seen such a sight. And at your age, Uncle." Mary Poppins, come up here," said Michael. "Think of something funny and come up here." "Come, Mary Poppins, come up here," said Jane. "Please come up here. Think of something funny." "Oh, she can't do it even if she doesn't think of funny things," said Mr. Wick. "Well, it is all very silly," said Mary Poppins, "but I see that you can't come down." And to the great surprise of Jane and Michael, she put her hands down at her sides, and without a laugh, without even a smile, she flew up through the air and sat down near Jane. "That's right, Mary," said Mr. Wick. "Now we can have tea." "Oh, I didn't think of it. We're here, and the table is down there on the floor. Quick, we must think of something serious, something sad, very sad, and then we shall get down." They began thinking. They thought and thought, but couldn't think of anything serious. "Mary," said Mr. Wick, "can't you do something? We want our tea." Jane and Michael couldn't believe their eyes. The table, with 4 cups and bread and butter and biscuits and chocolates and cake, flew up through the air and stopped near them. Now they were sitting around the table. "Good girl," said Mr. Wick. He smiled. "Usually people begin with bread and butter," he said to Jane and Michael. "But it is my birthday today. Let's begin with the cake." And he cut a large piece of cake for everybody. And then had very nice tea with cake, biscuits and chocolates, and talked and laughed all the time. "It's time to go home." It was Mary Poppins' voice. It was the first sad thought of the afternoon, and suddenly the laughing gas went out of them, and they came down on the floor. "Well, it's pity that it is time for you to go home," said Mr. Wick. "It was a very pleasant afternoon, wasn't it?" "Yes, very pleasant," said Michael sadly. "Very, very pleasant," said Jane, and kissed Mr. Wick's cheek. "We shall never forget it." Okay, and now the task 1. Agree or disagree. So say yes or no. Mary Poppins put her head straight before a shop window. Today she was wearing a brown coat with black buttons and a grey hat. The door opened and they saw a very fat lady. Jane, Michael, and Mary Poppins went upstairs. There was a bright fire in the fireplace, and in the center of the room there was a small table with flowers in a beautiful vase. Jane and Michael looked round the room and saw a round, fat man in the corner. They wanted to be polite and tried not to laugh, but they could do nothing. Task 2. Who said the following words? Are you sure your uncle is at home? How can you call me Mrs. Wick? How do you do, Mrs. Wick? I have never seen such a sight. We must think of something serious. Я очень надеюсь, что вам понравилось это видео. The lesson is over. Goodbye.